The sun had barely risen over the hills east of Jerusalem, and already the air shimmered with the promise of unbearable heat. Amos stood at the threshold of his family's modest dwelling, a small structure of mud brick and straw nestled in the outskirts of a village called Bethphage, close enough to the great city to smell its markets, but far enough to feel its indifference. He was 23 years old, lean and sun-darkened, with calloused hands that told the story of a lifetime spent working stone and hauling water. His eyes, deep brown and constantly scanning the horizon, carried a weight far heavier than his years. On his feet were his only pair of sandals. They were not the fine leather sandals worn by Roman officials or wealthy merchants who passed through the region on their way to the temple. No. These were wooden platforms, carved crudely from a piece of sycamore by his late father. Attached to his feet by 2 strips of goat leather that had been repaired so many times they were more knot than strap. The wood had been worn smooth on the bottom from years of use, and on particularly hot days, Amos could feel the heat radiating through them as if the wood itself were slowly catching fire. His mother, Miriam, appeared behind him in the doorway. She was a small woman, her face lined by decades of sun and sorrow, her hands perpetually busy with some task, mending, grinding grain, kneading dough. She looked at her son with the particular gaze of a mother who knows her child is about to do something difficult and cannot stop him. "You do not have to go today," she said quietly. "The merchant can wait another day." Amos shook his head. "He cannot wait, mother, and we cannot wait. The grain is almost gone. If I do not deliver these stones to Matthias in Jerusalem by midday, we will not eat this week." Miriam pressed her lips together. She wanted to argue, but she knew the truth of his words. Since her husband, Eli, had passed away 2 winters ago from a fever that swept through the village, Amos had become the sole provider for her and his younger sister, Tamar, who was only 14. Eli had been a stonecutter, a man who could shape rock with the precision of an artist, and Amos had inherited his skill but not his reputation. In this world, reputation was currency, and without it, work was scarce and payment was thin. "At least wrap your feet," Miriam said, disappearing inside and returning with 2 strips of cloth. They were torn from an old garment, thin and frayed, but they were something. The road to Jerusalem will be cruel today. Amos took the cloth and knelt down. He carefully wound the strips around his feet before sliding them into the wooden sandals. It was a small comfort, like holding a single leaf over your head in a rainstorm, but he thanked his mother with a nod and a brief touch of her hand. He loaded the 2 carved stones onto the back of their donkey, a tired animal named Boaz who was almost as old as Amos himself. The stones were decorative pieces, commissioned by a merchant named Matthias, who dealt in fine goods for the homes of wealthy Romans and Sadducees in the upper city of Jerusalem. Matthias had promised 12 denarii for the pair, enough to buy grain, oil, and perhaps a small measure of dried fish that would last the family through the next 2 weeks. The road from Bethphage to Jerusalem was not long, perhaps an hour's walk for a healthy man on a cool day. But this was not a cool day. This was the height of the dry season, when the sun turned the limestone paths into white-hot ribbons that snaked through the barren hills. The road was dotted with other travelers, merchants leading camel trains, pilgrims heading to the temple, Roman soldiers on patrol, their heavy boots thudding against the ground with the confidence of men who owned the world. And among them, dozens of ordinary people like Amos, poor, determined, enduring. Amos felt the heat within the first 100 steps. It started as a warmth beneath his feet, almost pleasant in those first moments, like standing near a cooking fire. But within minutes, the warmth became discomfort, and the discomfort became a steady, throbbing ache that pulsed upward through his ankles and into his calves. The cloth his mother had given him was already damp with sweat, and instead of protecting his skin, it now clung to his feet like a hot compress, trapping the heat against his flesh. He kept walking. There was no choice. Stopping meant losing time, and losing time meant arriving after Matthias had closed his shop for the midday rest that all sensible people took during the hottest hours. If he missed Matthias, he would have to wait until evening, and by then, other stonecutters from other villages might have already offered their work at lower prices. Amos could not afford to be undercut. Not today. Not ever. The donkey, Boaz, plodded along beside him with the resignation of an animal that had long ago accepted its lot in life. Boaz did not wear sandals. His hooves, thick and hard as iron, were better suited for this terrain than any human foot, and Amos sometimes envied the creature. He had once joked with his father that God had been kinder to donkeys than to men when it came to feet, and Eli had laughed and said, "Perhaps, but donkeys cannot carve stone or sing psalms, so we are even." By the time Amos reached the crest of the Mount of Olives and could see the great city spread out before him, the walls gleaming white and gold in the merciless sun, his feet were in serious pain. He could feel blisters forming on the balls of his feet where the wood pressed hardest, and the leather straps had rubbed raw spots on the tops of his toes. He paused for a moment, not to rest but to shift his weight, trying to find some position that hurt less than the others. A Roman soldier passed him on horseback, the animal's hooves kicking up a cloud of dust that settled on Amos like a fine, gritty blanket. The soldier did not look at him. To Rome, Amos was invisible, a conquered subject, a worker, a body meant to labor and pay taxes and stay out of the way. Amos watched the soldier ride ahead, noting the man's boots, thick leather, laced up to the mid-calf, with iron studs on the soles for grip. Those boots were designed for marching, for conquering, for standing on the necks of nations. Amos's sandals were designed for survival and barely managed that. He descended the Mount of Olives and entered the Kidron Valley, where the heat seemed to concentrate as if the hills on either side were walls of an oven. The smell of the city grew stronger, a mixture of animal dung, cooking spices, incense from the temple, and the ever-present dust that coated everything. Amos navigated through the crowds at the gate, pulling Boaz close to avoid the crush of bodies, carts, and livestock that clogged the narrow entrance. Inside the city, the streets were a maze of shadow and light. The taller buildings provided occasional relief from the sun, and Amos instinctively sought out these patches of shade, walking a zigzag path through the market district that added time to his journey, but gave his feet brief moments of respite. He could see other people doing the same, ordinary men and women hugging the walls, slipping through alleyways, doing anything to avoid the direct sunlight that turned the open plazas into fields of fire. He found Matthias's shop in the lower market, a cluttered storefront filled with pottery, textiles, carved wood, and decorative stonework. Matthias was a heavy-set man with a thick beard and shrewd eyes that could assess the value of any object in seconds. He was sitting in the shade of his awning, fanning himself with a palm leaf when Amos approached. "You are late," Matthias said, not unkindly, but with the bluntness of a man who measured everything in time and money. "The road was difficult," Amos replied, unloading the stones from Boaz's back and setting them carefully on Matthias's inspection table. Matthias leaned forward and examined the stones. They were rectangular pieces of white limestone, carved with an intricate pattern of vines and leaves, the kind of decorative element that wealthy homeowners like to place above doorways or along garden walls. Amos had spent 3 days carving them, working by lamplight after his regular labor was done, his fingers raw and his back aching. "The work is good," Matthias admitted, running his fingers over the carved surface. "Your father taught you well." He paused, and Amos could see the calculation happening behind those shrewd eyes. "I will give you 10 denarii. "We agreed on 12, Amos said, keeping his voice steady even as frustration tightened his chest. "That was before I saw the size. These are smaller than what I specified." "They are exactly the size you specified. I measured them against the template you gave me." Matthias waved his hand dismissively. "The market has changed. A shipment of Egyptian stone arrived last week, and my customers prefer it. I am doing you a kindness by offering 10. Amos stood very still. He could feel the blisters on his feet throbbing, could feel the sweat running down his back, could feel the weight of his mother's worried eyes and his sister's hungry belly pressing down on his shoulders. 10 denarii would feed his family, but it would not cover the cost of the raw stone he had purchased, which meant he would be working at a loss. 12 denarii was fair. 10 was exploitation, and both of them knew it. 12, Amos said again, "or I take my stones and find another buyer." Matthias studied him for a long moment, then smiled, the kind of smile that powerful men give to those who dare to stand their ground. 11. Final offer. Take it or walk away. Amos calculated. 11 denarii minus the 4 he had spent on raw stone, and the half denarius for the leather to repair Boaz's harness, left him with 6.5 denarii. It was thin. It was always thin. But it was enough. 11, he agreed. Matthias counted out the coins, and Amos tucked them into the pouch at his belt, feeling their small weight with a mixture of relief and bitterness. He had walked for an hour in burning heat, wearing sandals that offered no more protection than bare faith, to earn 11 coins that would keep his family alive for perhaps 12 days. And then he would have to do it again. Confira-se já é inscrito neste canal. If stories of resilience, struggle, and the raw human spirit move something inside you, then this is where you belong. Subscribe now so you never miss a single chapter. The walk home was worse. The sun was directly overhead now, and the road had absorbed hours of relentless heat, turning every stone and every grain of sand into a tiny ember beneath his feet. Amos moved as quickly as he could, but speed came with its own punishment, each step driving his weight harder into the wooden platforms, pressing the blisters against the unyielding surface. He tried walking on the edges of the road where sparse grass sometimes grew, but even the vegetation had surrendered to the heat, lying flat and dry against the scorched earth. He thought about his father as he walked. Eli had made these sandals when Amos was 19, just a year before he passed away. He had carved them from a single piece of sycamore wood, shaping them carefully to match the contours of his son's feet, smoothing the surface with a flat stone until it was as polished as he could make it. "They will not last forever," Eli had told him, "but they will carry you farther than you think." Amos had not understood those words then. He understood them now. The truth was that footwear in this age was a marker of status as clear as any crown or title. The Roman soldiers wore their hobnailed boots, the kaligai, designed by engineers, tested in battle, manufactured in workshops that employed dozens of skilled leather workers. The wealthy wore soft leather sandals, sometimes dyed in colors, lined with wool or cotton, designed for comfort and beauty. The priests in the temple wore white sandals that were replaced regularly, their feet never touching the bare ground of the outer courts. And then there were people like Amos, the laborers, the farmers, the shepherds, the fishermen, who wore whatever they could make or whatever they could afford, which was usually nothing more than a flat piece of wood or leather strapped to their feet with whatever binding material was available. Some people wore no shoes at all. Amos had seen them in the villages and on the roads, men and women and children walking barefoot on ground that could blister skin in minutes. Their feet were thick with calluses, the soles so hardened by years of exposure that they resembled leather more than flesh. But even these hardened feet had limits. Amos had once seen a child, no more than 7 years old, standing in the middle of the road outside his village, crying silently, unable to move because the ground was too hot and his mother was too far ahead to hear him. Amos had carried the boy to the shade of a nearby tree and waited with him until his mother came back, frantic and grateful. The boy's feet had been bright red, the skin already peeling. That image had stayed with Amos like a scar. When Amos arrived home, Miriam took one look at his face and knew the day had been hard. She did not ask about the money. She simply took the pouch he offered, counted the coins silently, and nodded. Then she heated water over the small cooking fire and brought it to him in a clay basin. "Sit," she said. Amos lowered himself onto the stone bench outside their door and placed his feet in the warm water. The relief was immediate and overwhelming. He closed his eyes and breathed deeply, feeling the tension in his body slowly uncoil. Miriam knelt beside him and carefully removed the cloth wrappings, which had fused to his skin in places where the blisters had opened. She worked gently, patiently, the way she did everything, with a quiet competence born of a lifetime of tending to the injuries of men who worked with their hands and walked on their feet. "You need new sandals," she said, not as an accusation but as a statement of fact. "I know. There is a sandal maker in Bethany, old Simeon. He is not expensive." "He is expensive enough," Amos replied. "And what he makes is little better than what I have. The good leather goes to the Romans and the rich. What is left for us is scraps." Miriam said nothing. She dried his feet with a clean cloth and applied a paste made from olive oil and crushed herbs, a remedy her own mother had taught her. It soothed the raw skin and cooled the inflammation, and Amos felt a gratitude toward this small, quiet woman that he could never adequately express. Tamar appeared in the doorway, her young face bright with curiosity. "Did you see the city, brother? Did you see the temple?" Amos smiled despite his exhaustion. Tamar had never been to Jerusalem. The journey was too far and too dangerous for a young girl traveling without a large family group, and there had never been an occasion, a festival or a wedding, that warranted the trip. She dreamed of seeing the temple, of hearing the priests chant, of witnessing the great gatherings that she had only heard about in stories. "I saw the walls," he told her, "and the market, and many people. Was it wonderful?" He thought of the crushing crowds, the dust, the smell, the soldier who had not seen him, the merchant who had cheated him, the road that had tried to consume his feet. "It was something," he said. That evening, as the family shared a simple meal of bread, lentils, and a few olives, Amos made a decision. He would take on the most ambitious project of his young career. He had heard through the network of gossip that connected every village in the region that a Roman official named Gaius Petronius was building a new villa on the road between Jerusalem and Jericho. Petronius needed stonework, columns, lintels, decorative panels, the kind of work that Eli had been renowned for but that Amos had never attempted on his own. The pay, if he could secure the contract, would be enough to sustain his family for months. Perhaps even enough to buy proper sandals, real leather ones, the kind that did not make every journey a trial of endurance. But the road to Jericho was long, much longer than the road to Jerusalem. And it descended through some of the most desolate, sun-blasted terrain in the entire region, dropping from the hills of Jerusalem into the Jordan Valley, a landscape of bare rock and shimmering heat that travelers called the Valley of Shadow, not because of darkness, but because the heat was so intense that the air itself seemed to distort, creating phantom images that danced just beyond reach. Amos knew the road. He had traveled it once with his father as a boy, and the memory was seared into his mind, the relentless descent, the way the heat grew more punishing with every step downward, the bleached bones of animals that had collapsed and been left by the roadside. It was on that road that his father had told him the story of how their ancestors had wandered in the wilderness for 40 years, their sandals miraculously preserved by divine will. Amos was not sure he believed in that kind of miracle anymore. His sandals were falling apart, and no divine intervention seemed forthcoming. But the opportunity was real, and desperation has a way of making dangerous things seem reasonable. The next morning, Amos went to see the village elder, a man named Jacob, who served as an informal broker between the local craftsmen and the outside world. Jacob was old, past 60, with a white beard that reached his chest and a mind as sharp as a new chisel. He sat beneath the ancient fig tree that marked the center of the village, dispensing advice and collecting a small percentage of every transaction he facilitated. "Petronius," Jacob repeated, stroking his beard. Yes, I have heard of this project. He is spending Roman gold like water. But he is also Roman, which means he expects perfection and pays late. Will he hire me? Jacob looked at Amos with an appraising eye. Your father's work, yes. Your work, I do not know. You are young. You have skill, but you do not have a name. Petronius will want to see examples. I can bring examples. The stones I carved for Matthias are good work. Matthias is a market trader. Petronius is a Roman prefect. There is a difference between decorating a garden wall and adorning a villa that will be seen by senators. Jacob paused, then added, But I will send word. I know a man who knows a man who serves in Petronius's household. It will take time. How much time? A week, perhaps 2. Amos nodded. 2 weeks was a long time when your grain supply was measured in days, but it was also an eternity of hope, and hope was a currency that cost nothing and sustained everything. During those 2 weeks, Amos worked. He took on every small job he could find, repairing a wall for a neighbor, carving a simple basin for a family in the next village, hauling stone from a quarry half a day's walk to the north. Each job paid a few coins, barely enough to justify the labor, but together they formed a thin lifeline that kept his family fed. And every day, he walked. He walked to the quarry and back. He walked to neighboring villages. He walked to the well and to the fields and to every place that labor called him. And every day, his feet paid the price. The blisters became calluses, and the calluses cracked, and the cracks sometimes wept with fluid that stained the cloth wrappings his mother prepared each morning. The wooden sandals, already worn thin, developed a crack along the left platform that Amos tried to repair with a strip of wet leather that he hoped would shrink and tighten as it dried. It held, barely, but every step now came with a faint creaking sound, like a warning. One afternoon, while working at the quarry, Amos met a man who would change the trajectory of his life. His name was Nathan, and he was a traveler, a wandering teacher who moved between villages sharing stories and wisdom in exchange for food and shelter. Nathan was perhaps 40, with a lean face weathered by years of walking, and a gentle manner that put people at ease. He wore sandals of braided palm fiber, not much better than Amos's wooden ones, but lighter and more flexible, and he carried nothing but a staff and a small bag slung over one shoulder. Nathan had stopped at the quarry to rest in the shade of a large boulder, and when Amos took his own rest break, they fell into conversation. You work hard, Nathan observed, watching Amos unwrap the cloth from his feet to let the air cool his skin. I work because I must, Amos replied, as do we all. But there is a difference between working from necessity and working from purpose. The first keeps you alive. The second gives you a reason to be alive. Amos looked at the older man. That sounds like something a man says who has never had to choose between feeding his family and resting his feet. Nathan laughed, a genuine warm sound that seemed out of place in the harsh landscape. I have made that choice many times, young friend, and my feet bear the evidence. He lifted one foot and showed Amos the sole, thick with scars and old calluses, a map of thousands of miles walked on roads very much like this one. I have walked from Dan to Beersheba and back again. I have walked the shores of the Great Sea and the banks of the Jordan. Every road has taught me something, and my feet have been my most honest teachers. What have they taught you? Amos asked, genuinely curious despite his fatigue. That pain is not the enemy. Stillness is. A man who stops moving because his feet hurt will never reach the place where his feet can rest. But a man who keeps walking, even in pain, will eventually find ground that is cool and soft and welcoming. The road is not your punishment. It is your passage. Amos considered this. With respect, that is easy to say when you are sitting in the shade. Nathan smiled again. You are right. Wisdom is always easier sitting down. But the walking is where you earn the right to the shade. They talked for a while longer, and Amos found himself opening up to this stranger in a way he rarely did with anyone. He told Nathan about his father, about Miriam and Tamar, about the struggle to make a living in a world that seemed designed to grind ordinary people into dust. He told him about the sandals, about how they were the last thing his father had made for him, how they were falling apart, how every step was becoming a negotiation between his will and his body. Nathan listened with the attentiveness of a man for whom listening was a craft as refined as stone cutting. When Amos finished, Nathan reached into his bag and pulled out a small clay jar. This is a salve, he said, made from beeswax, olive oil, and the resin of the balsam tree. It will not fix your sandals, but it will protect your skin. Apply it before you walk, and the heat will not penetrate as deeply. Amos took the jar. Thank you. What do I owe you? Nothing, or everything. It depends on what you do with the miles you walk in less pain. Nathan stood, brushed the dust from his robe, and picked up his staff. I will be in Bethphage for 2 more days, staying with old Ezra near the well. Come see me if you want to talk more. And Amos, the road to the thing you need most is always the road you are most afraid to walk. Then Nathan was gone, moving down the path with the easy gait of a man who had made peace with the ground beneath his feet. That night, Amos applied the salve. It had a warm, resinous smell that reminded him of the temple incense he had smelled from afar during a Passover many years ago. He rubbed it into his feet, paying special attention to the cracks and raw spots, and by the time he was done, his skin felt cooler and more supple than it had in months. He did not know if it would make a real difference on the road, but the act of caring for his feet, of treating them as something worth preserving rather than merely enduring, felt like a small revolution. The next morning, word came from Jacob. Gaius Petronius had agreed to consider Amos for the stonework contract, but there was a condition. Amos had to present himself at the villa construction site on the Jericho Road within 3 days, bringing a sample of his best work. If Petronius approved the sample, Amos would receive the commission. If not, he would have wasted the journey. 3 days. The villa was a full day's walk from Bethphage, which meant Amos would have to walk there, present his work, and walk back, all in the span of 3 days, covering some of the most inhospitable terrain in the region, in the worst heat of the season, in sandals that were held together by little more than habit and hope. Miriam's face went pale when he told her. "That road has claimed men far stronger than you," she said. "Last summer, 3 travelers were found dead on the descent, overcome by the heat." "I know the risks, Mother." "Do you? Do you know what it feels like to receive word that your son has been found on the side of the road, his feet blistered beyond recognition, his body empty of water and life?" Her voice cracked on the last word, and Amos felt the weight of her fear like a physical force. He went to her and placed his hands on her shoulders. "I will not be found on the side of the road. I am Eli's son. I was built for hard roads." Miriam looked up at him, and in her eyes he saw something that went beyond fear. It was a fierce, desperate love that would burn hotter than any road. She nodded slowly. "Then I will prepare provisions, and you will take extra cloth for your feet. And you will start before dawn, before the sun has any power." Amos left Bethphage while the stars were still visible in the western sky. He had loaded Boaz with his best carved stone, a decorative panel depicting a cluster of grapes and olive branches, the finest work he had ever produced, and a supply of water in 2 goatskin bags that Miriam had filled to bursting. He carried bread, dried figs, and a small piece of hard cheese that would sustain him through the long walk. And on his feet, freshly wrapped in clean cloth and coated with Nathan's balsam salve, were his father's wooden sandals. The road east from Jerusalem toward Jericho was among the most famous and feared in the region. It descended nearly 3,000 feet over a distance of 17 miles, winding through a landscape that grew increasingly desolate with every step. The hills were bare and rocky, scored by deep wadis that channeled floodwaters in the rainy season, but now lay dry and empty, their pale stone glaring in the sun like the exposed ribs of some ancient, enormous creature. Travelers called this road the Path of the Scorpion, because of the creatures that lurked beneath rocks along its margins, and bandits were known to haunt the more isolated stretches, preying on merchants and pilgrims. Amos moved quickly in the pre-dawn cool, his steps light and confident on ground that had not yet absorbed the full fury of the sun. Boaz kept pace beside him, the donkey's ears twitching at the small sounds of the desert, the scurry of a lizard, the distant call of a bird, the whisper of wind through a narrow gorge. For the first hour, the journey felt almost pleasant. The air was still cool, the sky was turning from black to deep blue, to the pale gold of approaching sunrise, and the road was smooth and well-maintained, a testament to Roman engineering that, whatever one thought of the empire, made travel possible across vast distances. But as the sun crested the eastern horizon and began its relentless climb, the nature of the journey changed. The cool air evaporated as if it had been an illusion, replaced by a heat that grew from uncomfortable to oppressive to genuinely dangerous within the span of an hour. The road, which had been merely warm, became hot enough that Amos could feel each stone through his sandals as if it were a coal placed deliberately in his path. The cloth wrappings dampened with sweat, and the balsam salve, while helpful, could not entirely block the heat that rose from the ground in visible waves. Amos developed a rhythm. Walk for 500 paces, counting each one. Stop for 30 breaths in whatever shade could be found, even if it was only the narrow shadow of a boulder barely wider than his body. Drink a small measure of water, just enough to wet his mouth and throat without depleting his supply too quickly. Check the cloth on his feet, adjust the straps of his sandals, and move on. 500 paces. 30 breaths. A sip of water. Repeat. By the 4th hour of his journey, Amos had descended into the deepest part of the valley, where the heat was most concentrated and the terrain was most barren. There were no trees here, no bushes, no grass, nothing alive or green as far as the eye could see. Just rock and sand and the white ribbon of the road stretching ahead and behind, connecting 2 worlds and belonging to neither. The silence was profound, broken only by the sound of his own breathing, the creak of his sandals, and the soft thud of Boaz's hooves. His feet were suffering. Despite the cloth and the salve, the prolonged exposure to the heated ground was taking its toll. The blisters that had partially healed had reopened, and new ones were forming in places where the wood pressed hardest against his sole. The crack in the left sandal had widened, and he could feel a sharp edge of wood pressing against his arch with every step, a small blade that he could not escape. He thought of Nathan's words. Pain is not the enemy. Stillness is. Keep walking. The cool ground is ahead. He thought of his father, Eli, who had walked these same roads, who had carried stones heavier than the one on Boaz's back, who had built walls and carved monuments and provided for his family with nothing but his hands and his endurance. Eli, whose sandals had been no better than Amos's, whose feet had borne the same punishment, who had never complained, never stopped, never wavered. He thought of Tamar, her young face bright with dreams of a world beyond the village, a world she would never see if Amos could not earn enough to give her opportunities beyond what their small life could offer. He kept walking. And here is where I need to pause and ask you something. If this story, this account of one man's struggle against the simple, brutal reality of walking on scorching ground, has touched something inside you, then I want you to leave a comment right now. Type these words: I would have kept walking too. Because that is what this story is about. It is about the choice to keep going when everything tells you to stop. Leave that comment and let us see how many of us carry that same fire. Amos encountered two other travelers on the descent. The first was an elderly man riding a mule, his face shaded by a wide cloth draped over his head. The man nodded to Amos as he passed, but did not stop. The second was a young woman walking alone, carrying a large clay jar on her head with the effortless grace that came from a lifetime of practice. She was heading uphill, toward Jerusalem, and her face was set with the same grim determination that Amos felt in his own jaw. They exchanged a brief glance, two human beings acknowledging each other's struggle without words, and then she was gone, climbing the road that Amos was descending, her bare feet moving over the hot stone with a speed and confidence that spoke of calluses built over years. By midday, Amos reached the area where the villa was being constructed. He could see it from a distance, a large complex of stone and timber rising from the hillside like a declaration of Roman ambition. Workers swarmed over the structure, dozens of men hauling stone, mixing mortar, raising walls. The sound of hammers and chisels echoed through the valley, a rhythmic counterpoint to the silence of the desert. He presented himself to the foreman, a large, sun-darkened man named Rufus, who spoke broken Aramaic with a thick Roman accent. Rufus examined Amos's sample stone with a professional eye, turning it over in his thick hands, running his fingers along the carved surfaces. Good detail, Rufus said. Clean lines. Who trained you? My father, Eli of Bethphage. Do not know him, but the work speaks for itself. He set the stone down and looked at Amos. Petronius will see you in 1 hour. Wait in the shade. You look like the road has been hard on you. Amos found a spot beneath a canvas awning where workers took their rest breaks. He sat down heavily, and for the first time that day, he allowed himself to acknowledge the full extent of his physical state. His feet were throbbing with a deep burning ache that pulsed in time with his heartbeat. His legs were trembling with fatigue. His skin was tight with dried sweat and dust, and his lips were cracked despite the water he had been drinking. He carefully unwrapped his feet and saw what he already felt. The blisters had merged into large, fluid-filled patches on both soles, and the raw spots where the straps met his skin were red and weeping. He applied the last of Nathan's salve, gently massaging it into the damaged skin, and rewrapped his feet with the cleanest of his remaining cloth strips. Then he ate the last of his bread and figs and drank deeply from his remaining water skin. He would need more water for the return journey, but that was a problem for later. Right now, everything depended on the next hour. Gaius Petronius was not what Amos expected. He was a small man, barely taller than Miriam, with fine features and intelligent eyes that moved quickly, assessing everything with the efficiency of a man accustomed to making rapid decisions about large sums of money. He wore a white toga with a thin purple stripe that indicated his rank, and on his feet were sandals of the finest leather, soft and supple, the kind that molded to the foot like a second skin. Petronius examined the carved stone panel for several long minutes, occasionally asking Rufus a question in Latin that Amos could not understand. Then he turned to Amos and spoke in passable Aramaic. You are young for such work. I am experienced enough, Amos replied, keeping his voice respectful but not servile. Your father was a stonecutter? The best in our village. He taught me everything he knew. And he is no longer alive? No. Petronius nodded, as if this fact was relevant to his assessment. I need 42 decorative panels for the east wing of my villa. Each must be of this quality or better. Can you deliver them? 42 panels. At his current rate of production, that was at least 2 months of work. The payment would be substantial, potentially life-changing. I can, Amos said. You will be paid per panel, upon delivery and inspection. 1.5 denarii per panel. Amos's heart sank. 1.5 denarii per panel was barely more than what Matthias paid for simpler work, and these panels required far more skill and time. At that rate, after the cost of raw stone, tools, and the repeated journeys to deliver the finished work, his profit would be minimal. With respect, sir, Amos said, choosing his words carefully, the quality you are requesting requires the finest limestone and considerable time. 2 denarii per panel would be a fair price. Petronius's expression did not change. 1.5 is my price. I have other stonecutters who would accept it gladly. Amos looked at the Roman, at his fine sandals, at his purple-striped toga, at the massive villa rising behind him, built on wealth extracted from a conquered people. He thought of the 17 miles of burning road he had walked to stand here, the blisters on his feet, the crack in his sandal, the 11 denarii that Matthias had grudgingly paid. He thought of all the small indignities that accumulated in the life of a poor man, each one insignificant on its own, but together forming a weight that could crush a person's spirit as surely as the sun crushed the road. And then he thought of Tamar's face, bright with dreams. 1 3/4, Amos said. That is my final offer. Petronius raised an eyebrow. It was, Amos realized, the eyebrow of a man who was surprised to be negotiated with by a young stonecutter in battered wooden sandals. For a moment, the outcome hung in the balance, the entire future of Amos's family suspended on the expression of a Roman official who probably spent more on wine in a week than Amos earned in a month. Then Petronius nodded. 1 3/4, but the quality must be impeccable. If any panel is substandard, you will redo it at your own cost. Understood, Amos said, and something inside him, something that had been clenched with fear and doubt, released. The contract was sealed with a handshake, a gesture that crossed cultural boundaries even in this divided world. Amos left the villa site with a lightness in his chest that contrasted sharply with the heaviness in his feet. 42 panels at 1 3/4 denarii each. 73.5 denarii total. After costs, he would clear perhaps 50 denarii, enough to sustain his family for several months, enough to buy proper sandals, enough to buy tools, enough to begin building the reputation that would secure his future. But first, he had to get home. The return journey was the hardest physical challenge Amos had ever faced. The afternoon sun was at its peak, and the road, which had been brutally hot on the descent, was now a crucible of reflected heat as he climbed back up toward Jerusalem. Every step was a battle. The blisters on his feet had been compressed by the descent, and now the uphill climb stretched them, pulling the damaged skin taut and sending sharp jolts of pain through his legs. The crack in his left sandal widened further, and at one point the wood flexed enough that the strap pulled free from its mounting hole. Amos had to stop, kneel on the burning road, and retie the strap using a knot that he knew would not hold for more than a mile. He was out of salve. He was low on water, and the sun showed no sign of mercy. The 5th mile of the return was the worst. Amos entered a stretch of road that ran through a narrow canyon where the rock walls on either side trapped and magnified the heat. The air in this canyon was so hot that breathing it felt like inhaling steam, and the ground was so superheated that he could see small cracks forming in the clay surface, tiny fractures caused by the expansion of moisture deep in the earth. His feet, even through the wood and cloth, felt as if they were being held over an open flame. Each step was accompanied by a sound, a soft hiss as the moisture in his wrappings evaporated on contact with the heated sandal. He began to falter. His pace, which had been steady if slow, became erratic. He stumbled, caught himself, stumbled again. Boaz, sensing his master's distress, slowed and pressed close to Amos's side, offering his warm, solid body as a support. Amos leaned against the donkey and kept moving, one step at a time, counting not 500 but 10, just 10 steps before the next pause. In that canyon, at the lowest point of his strength, Amos had a thought that was not so much an idea as a vision. He saw himself from above, a tiny figure on a ribbon of white road, surrounded by an immensity of heat and stone. He was insignificant. He was one man among millions, one pair of burning feet among countless others, one small life struggling against forces that dwarfed him in every dimension. And yet he was moving. He was still moving. He had not stopped. He had not laid down. He had not surrendered to the heat or the pain or the overwhelming futility of being a poor man in a world built for the powerful. That was something. That was, perhaps, everything. He emerged from the canyon as the sun began its descent toward the western hills. The heat was still formidable, but it had lost its peak intensity, and the shadows of the hills were beginning to stretch across the road, offering patches of relative cool. Amos moved from shadow to shadow, like a man crossing a river by stepping on stones, each cool patch a moment of grace before the next stretch of fire. By the time he crested the Mount of Olives and saw the distant lights of Bethphage flickering in the purple twilight, Amos was walking on what could barely be called feet. The blisters had burst and dried. The cloth wrappings were gone, shed somewhere on the road behind him. The left sandal had split completely, and he held it to his foot by gripping with his toes, a constant clenching effort that sent cramps up his calf. The right sandal was intact but had worn through at the heel, and he could feel the bare wood scraping against a raw patch of skin with each step. But he was walking. He was still walking. Miriam saw him coming from the doorway. She did not run to him, because running would have suggested panic, and Miriam did not allow herself panic. Instead, she walked steadily toward him, took Boaz's lead rope from his hand, and guided both man and donkey home with the calm authority of a woman who had been waiting all day and had resolved to be strong regardless of what she found. Inside, she heated water. She unwrapped what remained of the cloth. She cleaned his feet with a tenderness that was almost unbearable. And when Amos told her about the contract, about the 42 panels and the 73.5 denarii, Miriam closed her eyes and pressed her hands together and whispered words that Amos recognized as a prayer of gratitude so deep it had no formal language, just the raw sound of relief. The weeks that followed were the most productive and the most grueling of Amos's life. He worked from the first light of dawn until the last flicker of his oil lamp, cutting and carving limestone with a precision and passion that surprised even himself. Each panel was a conversation between his hands and the stone, a negotiation of force and finesse that required total concentration. He used chisels that he sharpened every evening, a mallet that had been his father's, and a set of templates that he had drawn on flat pieces of pottery, patterns of leaves and vines and geometric borders that were sophisticated enough to please a Roman eye. Miriam and Tamar helped where they could. Miriam mixed the polishing paste from sand and oil. Tamar fetched water and carried messages to Jacob, who served as the intermediary between Amos and the villa's foreman. The family operated as a unit, each member contributing to a shared goal with the efficiency of people who understood that their survival depended on collective effort. Every 7 days, Amos loaded 2 or 3 finished panels onto Boaz and made the journey to the villa on the Jericho Road. Each trip was a test of endurance, a repetition of the heat and the pain and the relentless negotiation with the ground. But something had changed. Whether it was Nathan's salve, which he had managed to replicate using beeswax and balsam resin purchased from a trader in Bethany, or whether it was simply the toughening of his feet through repeated exposure, the journeys became gradually more bearable. Not easy. Never easy. But survivable in a way that no longer left him shattered at the end. He also invested in his sandals. With the first payment from Petronius, he went to Old Simeon in Bethany and purchased a proper pair of leather straps to replace the worn goat hide that had held his father's wooden platforms to his feet. The difference was remarkable. The new straps distributed pressure more evenly, reduced the rubbing that caused blisters, and held the sandals more securely, eliminating the constant fear that a strap would snap at the worst possible moment. The wooden platforms themselves were beyond saving, worn so thin in places that they were translucent when held up to the light, but Amos was not ready to replace them. They were his father's work. They were his connection to Eli, and he would wear them until they literally fell apart beneath him. On one of his delivery trips, Amos encountered Nathan again. The wandering teacher was sitting by the side of the Jericho Road, in the shade of a rare acacia tree, eating dates from a small bag. He looked up as Amos approached and smiled with recognition. "The stonecutter. I see you are still walking." "I am still walking," Amos confirmed. "And my feet are grateful for your salve." "Your feet are grateful for your will." "The salve is just wax and oil. The will is something no jar can contain." They sat together in the shade, sharing dates and water, and Amos told Nathan about the contract with Petronius, about the 42 panels, about the transformation that the work was bringing to his life and his family's prospects. Nathan listened with his characteristic attentiveness, nodding and asking occasional questions that showed he was not merely hearing, but understanding. "And the road?" Nathan asked. "Has it become easier?" "The road is the same. I have become different." Nathan regarded him with an expression that was almost proud. "That is the most important lesson any road can teach. The path does not change. You do." "But I wish the path would change," Amos admitted. "I wish it were not so hot. I wish my sandals were not so thin. I wish I did not have to negotiate with pain every time I step outside my door." "Of course you do. Wishing for less suffering is not weakness. It is wisdom. The question is whether you let the wish stop you or let it drive you to create something better." "Is that why you walk? To create something better?" Nathan was quiet for a moment. "I walk because there are people in every village who are burning, and I do not mean their feet. I mean their spirits. They are on fire with loneliness, with grief, with the sense that they are small and forgotten. I cannot put out those fires, but I can sit with people while they burn. And sometimes, that is enough." Amos thought about this long after Nathan had continued on his way. He thought about it while he carved stone, while he walked the burning road, while he soaked his feet in warm water at the end of each day. He thought about the woman he had passed on the Jericho Road, walking barefoot with a jar on her head. He thought about the child standing frozen in the heat, unable to move. He thought about all the people in this world who walked on fire every day, not because they chose to, but because the world gave them no other option. On his 5th delivery to the villa, Amos met someone new. Her name was Lydia, and she was a weaver who supplied textiles to the villa's interior decorators. She was perhaps 20 years old, with dark hair pulled back in a practical braid and eyes that were the color of honey in sunlight. She was examining bolts of cloth in the shade of the workers' tent when Amos arrived with his panels, and their eyes met with the particular intensity that occurs when two people recognize something familiar in a stranger. They did not speak that day. Amos was focused on his delivery and the inspection by Rufus, who had become increasingly appreciative of his work, and Lydia was negotiating with a Roman supply clerk over the price of dyed linen. But Amos noticed her sandals. They were woven from palm fiber, similar to Nathan's but more carefully made, with thick soles that would provide real insulation from the ground and flexible uppers that would move with the foot. They looked comfortable. They looked functional. They looked like something made by someone who understood feet. On his next delivery, a week later, Amos deliberately arrived early, hoping to see her again. He found her in the same tent, this time organizing spools of thread by color, her fingers moving with the swift dexterity of a lifelong weaver. "Your panels are beautiful," she said without looking up. "Rufus showed me one, the grapevine pattern." "Thank you," Amos replied, surprised that she had noticed his work. "Your textiles are also impressive. The colors are vivid." Now she looked up, and her smile was warm and direct. "I use pomegranate for red, indigo for blue, and saffron for yellow. My mother taught me. She was the best dyer in Bethany." "Bethany? I know Bethany. Old Simeon the sandal maker is there." "Simeon is my uncle," Lydia said. "He made these sandals for me." She lifted one foot to show him, and Amos studied the construction with genuine interest. "They look well made. Better than mine, certainly." He gestured toward his battered wooden platforms. Lydia's eyes widened. "You walk the Jericho Road in those?" "Every week." She shook her head slowly. "That is either very brave or very stubborn." "My mother would say stubborn. My father would have said brave. I think it is just necessary." They talked for an hour that day, and the hour passed like a minute. Amos learned that Lydia's father had been a merchant who was lost at sea during a trading voyage to Egypt 5 years earlier, leaving Lydia and her mother to support themselves through weaving and dyeing. It was a story Amos recognized. The sudden loss of a father, the scramble to survive, the daily grind of labor that left little room for anything else. They were two people shaped by the same forge, and the recognition of shared experience created a bond that felt immediate and deep. Over the following weeks, Amos and Lydia's meetings at the villa became the bright spots in his grueling routine. They would find excuses to overlap their delivery schedules, sitting together during rest breaks, sharing food, exchanging stories about their families and their work. Lydia had a sharp wit and a practical intelligence that Amos found deeply attractive, and she seemed equally drawn to his quiet determination and the way he talked about stone, with a passion and knowledge that revealed the artist beneath the laborer. One day, Lydia presented Amos with a gift. It was a pair of sandals, handmade by her uncle Simeon at her request, using the best leather in his shop and palm fiber soles triple woven for durability and insulation. They were not elegant. They would never be mistaken for Roman footwear, but they were solid, well-made, and designed specifically for the demands of the Jericho Road. "I cannot accept these," Amos said, even as his feet, encased in their dying wooden shells, screamed at him to reconsider. "You can and you will," Lydia replied firmly. "Consider it an investment. If your feet give out, you cannot deliver panels, and if you cannot deliver panels, Rufus will need a new stonecutter, and the next one will probably not be as talented or as interesting to talk to." Amos looked at the sandals, then at Lydia, then back at the sandals. They were the most thoughtful gift anyone had given him since his father's wooden platforms, and they represented something more than practical footwear. They represented the fact that someone outside his family had noticed his struggle and cared enough to do something about it. He put them on. The leather was stiff with newness, but already more comfortable than anything he had ever worn. The palm fiber soles were thick and slightly springy, absorbing the shock of each step in a way that the rigid wooden platforms never could. The straps were wide and flat, distributing pressure across the top of his foot without digging into the skin. "How do they feel?" Lydia asked. Amos took a few steps, testing the fit. "Like walking on a cloud," he said. "If clouds were made of leather and palm fiber." Lydia laughed, and the sound of her laughter in the hot, dusty air of the Jericho Road was so incongruously beautiful that Amos felt something shift inside his chest, something that had been closed opening slowly, like a flower turning toward the sun. He kept his father's old sandals. He wrapped them carefully in cloth and placed them in a corner of his family's dwelling, where they sat like a memorial to the man who had made them and the miles they had carried his son. They were too worn to wear and too precious to discard, and Amos understood that they had served their purpose. They had carried him far enough. Now it was time for new shoes and new roads. The summer deepened, and Amos's reputation grew with every panel he delivered. Rufus, who had started as a skeptical overseer, became a genuine admirer of his work, often showing visiting officials the carved panels and pointing out the precision of the cuts and the elegance of the designs. Word spread through the network of builders and craftsmen that there was a young stonecutter in Bethphage whose work rivaled anything produced in the workshops of Jerusalem, and new commissions began to arrive. A synagogue in Jericho needed a carved lintel. A merchant in Bethany wanted decorative screens for his courtyard. A wealthy Pharisee in Jerusalem commissioned a large panel depicting a menorah flanked by palm branches, a piece that required such delicacy that Amos spent 3 weeks on it, working with tools so fine they could have been used for surgery. Each commission brought money, and each payment was invested in 2 things: the family's immediate needs and the tools and materials that would enable even better work. Amos's feet, meanwhile, had begun to heal. The new sandals from Lydia's uncle absorbed the worst of the road's heat, and the blisters that had been a constant companion for years gradually receded, replaced by healthy calluses that protected without causing pain. He still walked long distances in brutal heat, but the walking no longer felt like punishment. It felt like work, hard and honest and purposeful. And there is a vast difference between suffering for nothing and enduring for something. His relationship with Lydia deepened. Their meetings at the villa expanded into visits at her home in Bethany, where Amos would sit in her mother's courtyard and watch Lydia work at her loom, her fingers flying through the threads with a speed and surety that mirrored his own movements with chisel and mallet. Her mother, a woman named Ruth who had the same honey-colored eyes as her daughter, approved of Amos in the cautious, watchful way of mothers who want their daughters to be happy, but also to be safe. "He works hard," Ruth told Lydia one evening when she thought Amos was out of earshot. "That is good. But can he provide? Can he protect? The world is not kind to women without strong men." "He walked the Jericho road in wooden sandals that were falling apart," Lydia replied. "For his mother and sister, he negotiated with a Roman prefect and won. He carved stone so beautiful that soldiers stopped to look at it. Yes, mother, he can provide, and he can protect." Amos heard every word, and each one was a stone laid in the foundation of his confidence. As the weeks passed and the villa neared completion, Amos delivered the final panels of his commission. Rufus inspected each one with his customary thoroughness and pronounced them all acceptable, a word that, from Rufus, was equivalent to high praise. Petronius himself came to view the installed panels and nodded with the restrained satisfaction of a man who was accustomed to quality but still appreciated excellence. "Your work will stand in this villa for 100 years, Petronius told Amos. "Perhaps longer. When I am dust and this province has been forgotten by Rome, these stones will remain." It was, Amos realized, the greatest compliment a craftsman could receive, the assurance that his work would outlast him. He thought of his father, whose walls and carvings were scattered across the villages of the region, quietly enduring, quietly beautiful, quietly testifying to the skill and dedication of a man who had walked burning roads in sandals no better than the ones Amos had just retired. With the villa contract completed and the final payment received, Amos counted his earnings. After all expenses, he had accumulated 61 denarii, a sum that would have seemed unimaginable a few months earlier. It was enough to sustain his family through the coming winter and beyond. It was enough to buy new tools, better stone, proper supplies. It was enough to begin thinking about the future in terms of possibility, rather than mere survival. He used a portion of the money to commission Simeon to make sandals for his mother and Tamar. When Miriam received hers, she turned them over in her hands with an expression of wonder, running her fingers over the leather as if she could not believe something so well made was meant for her feet. "They are too fine for an old woman," she said. "They are exactly right for my mother," Amos replied. Tamar was less reserved. She put her sandals on immediately and walked around the house with the exaggerated steps of someone trying on new shoes, lifting each foot high and placing it down with ceremonial care. "I feel like a queen," she announced. "You are a queen," Amos told her. "A queen of Bethphage. And soon, I'm going to take you to see Jerusalem." Tamar's face lit up with a joy so intense, it was almost painful to witness. "The temple? You will take me to see the temple?" "I will take you to see everything." The trip to Jerusalem was planned for the following week, during a festival when the roads would be filled with pilgrims and the city would be alive with music and celebration. Amos prepared carefully, loading Boaz not with stones but with food and water for the journey, checking his sandals and Tamar's, ensuring that they had enough cloth wrappings and salve to protect their feet from the heat. The morning of the trip dawned clear and hot, as every morning did in this season, but there was a quality to the light that felt different, a golden warmth rather than a white blaze, as if even the sun had decided to be gentle for one day. Miriam stood at the doorway and watched her children set off, Amos tall and steady, Tamar practically dancing with excitement, Boaz plodding along with his usual stoic patience. "Be safe," Miriam called, "and bring her home before dark." "I will, mother." Oi? The walk to Jerusalem, which had once been a journey of pain and endurance for Amos, was transformed by Tamar's presence into something entirely different. She exclaimed at everything, the shape of the hills, the color of the wildflowers that clung to rocky crevices, the sight of a distant shepherd with his flock, the sound of other travelers singing as they walked. Her wonder was infectious, and Amos found himself seeing the landscape through her eyes, not as a hostile obstacle to be endured, but as a vast, beautiful, complicated world that was worthy of awe. "Does it hurt?" Tamar asked at one point, looking at his feet. "Not today," Amos said. And it was true. In his new sandals, on a road he had walked dozens of times, with his sister beside him and the promise of the city ahead, Amos felt something he had not felt in a very long time: ease. Jerusalem was everything Tamar had imagined and more. The walls loomed above them as they approached, massive blocks of stone fitted together with a precision that even Amos admired. Inside the gates, the city was a whirlwind of sound and color and smell, merchants calling out their wares, children running through the streets, the rich aroma of roasting meat and fresh bread mingling with the sharp scent of incense and the earthy smell of animals. Amos led Tamar through the market district, where she gazed with open-mouthed wonder at the displays of spices, fabrics, jewelry, and pottery that filled the stalls. He bought her a small piece of honeycomb, her first ever, and watched her face as she tasted the sweetness, an expression of pure, uncomplicated delight that reminded him of everything he was working for. They made their way to the Temple Mount, where the great structure rose above the city like a mountain of gold and white stone. Tamar stood at the bottom of the steps and looked up, her eyes wide, her mouth slightly open, and Amos saw in her expression the same awe that he had felt as a boy, the first time his father had brought him here. "It is beautiful," Tamar whispered. "It is," Amos agreed. They stood there for a long time, two ordinary people in a crowd of thousands, looking up at something extraordinary. And in that moment, Amos understood something that Nathan had been trying to tell him all along. The road was not the punishment. The road was the passage. The burning feet, the cracked sandals, the endless negotiation with pain and heat and hardship, all of it was the price of standing here, in this moment, with his sister beside him, looking up at something beautiful. The price was worth it. It had always been worth it. Months passed, and the seasons shifted. The brutal heat of summer gave way to the milder warmth of autumn, and eventually the cool rains of winter arrived, turning the dusty roads into muddy paths that presented a different set of challenges, but at least did not burn. Amos's reputation continued to grow, and by the time the following spring arrived, he was the most sought-after stonecutter in the region, with commissions that kept him busy from dawn to dusk and a waiting list of clients that stretched months into the future. He had built a small workshop attached to the family dwelling, a covered workspace where he could carve stone protected from the worst of the sun and rain. He had purchased a second donkey, a younger animal named Joseph, to share the burden of hauling stone with the aging Boaz. He had hired an apprentice, a boy of 16 from a neighboring village named Daniel, who showed promise with the chisel and who reminded Amos of himself at that age, eager and determined and wearing sandals that were barely worthy of the name. The first thing Amos did for Daniel was buy him a proper pair of sandals. The boy had been walking to the workshop each day in flat pieces of wood tied to his feet with rope, and the soles of his feet were a map of blisters and calluses that told the story of years of walking on hard, hot ground without protection. "You cannot do good work with bad feet," Amos told him, echoing something that Nathan had once said in different words. "Your feet are the foundation of everything. If they are in pain, your hands will tremble, your eyes will not focus, and the stone will know it." Daniel looked at the new sandals with the same wonder that Miriam had shown, the wonder of a person who is unaccustomed to being cared for. "I will repay you," the boy said. "You will repay me by learning well and walking far," Amos replied. Amos and Lydia were married in the spring, in a ceremony that took place in the courtyard of Ruth's home in Bethany. It was a simple event, as weddings among common people were, with shared food, prayers, and the traditional blessings. But it was also joyful, filled with the laughter of friends and neighbors who had watched both Amos and Lydia grow from struggling orphans into capable, respected adults. Miriam wept openly, the kind of tears that are too complex for a single emotion. Tears of joy and grief and relief and gratitude all mixed together, like a river fed by many streams. She embraced Lydia and whispered something in her ear that made the younger woman's eyes glisten. And then she embraced Amos and held him for a long time, her small body trembling against his. "Your father would be proud," she said. "I know, Mother." Lydia moved to Bethphage, bringing her loom and her dyes and her considerable skill. The household, once a place of quiet survival, became a hub of creative energy, with Amos carving stone in his workshop and Lydia weaving cloth in the courtyard. Tamar, now 15 and growing into a young woman of remarkable intelligence and spirit, divided her time between helping both of them, learning the basics of weaving from Lydia and developing an eye for design that would eventually lead her to create the patterns that Amos carved into stone. The family's fortunes had changed so dramatically that Amos sometimes had to remind himself of where he had started. On those occasions, he would go to the corner of the dwelling where his father's old wooden sandals sat, wrapped in their cloth, and he would hold them in his hands and remember. He would remember the weight of them, the hardness of the wood, the way the leather straps cut into his skin. He would remember the burning road, the white heat, the blisters that wept and the calluses that cracked. He would remember the feeling of being invisible, of being small, of being a poor man in a world that measured worth in coins and conquest, and then he would put the sandals down and step back into the life he had built. A life that was still hard, still demanding, still full of challenges, but that was also rich with purpose and love, and the satisfaction of work well done. One evening, as the sun set over the hills of Bethphage and the air cooled to a temperature that could almost be called comfortable, Amos sat outside his workshop with Lydia beside him. They were watching the sky turn from gold to orange to deep purple, a daily spectacle that never grew old. Tamar was inside, helping Miriam prepare the evening meal, and the sound of their voices and laughter drifted through the open doorway like music. "Do you ever think about the road?" Lydia asked. "Which road?" "The Jericho road. The one that almost broke you." Amos considered the question. I think about it every day, not with fear, not anymore, but with something that I cannot name. A kind of gratitude, perhaps. Or respect. The road taught me things that no teacher could have. What did it teach you? That the distance between where you are and where you need to be is never measured in miles. It is measured in steps, and each step, no matter how painful, moves you forward. The road does not care if you are rich or poor, Roman or Judean, wearing fine leather or broken wood. The road is the same for everyone. What matters is whether you keep walking. Lydia leaned against his shoulder. Nathan would approve of that wisdom. Nathan would say it is easier to be wise sitting down. They both laughed, and the sound carried into the evening air and mingled with the sounds of the village, the bleating of goats, the bark of a dog, the distant murmur of prayers from a neighbor's house. It was the sound of ordinary life, ordinary struggles, ordinary joys. And it was enough. It was more than enough. Amos never forgot the burning feet. He never forgot the wooden sandals or the cracked leather or the blisters that were the constant companions of his youth. As his success grew and his name became known throughout the region, he made it a practice to sponsor a sandal maker, first Simeon, and then, after Simeon retired, a young craftsman whom Daniel recommended, whose sole purpose was to provide proper footwear to those who could not afford it. Every month, a batch of well-made sandals was distributed to the poorest families in the surrounding villages, and Amos personally ensured that the quality was high enough to provide real protection. Why do you do this? A Roman client once asked him, puzzled by the expenditure. These people are laborers. They do not need fine sandals. Amos looked at the Roman, at his polished boots and his clean toga, and thought of all the things he could say about privilege and blindness, and the vast gulf between those who had always walked in comfort and those who knew what it meant to burn. But he simply said, "A man who walks in less pain can work with more skill. It is an investment." The Roman nodded, satisfied with an answer framed in terms he could understand. Amos did not bother explaining the deeper truth, that every pair of sandals he gave away was a message to a struggling family, a message that said, someone sees you. Someone remembers what it feels like. Someone cares enough to put leather between your skin and the fire. Years later, long after the villa on the Jericho Road had become one of the most admired private residences in the region, with Amos's stone panels gracing its walls like frozen poetry, a young traveler stopped at the workshop in Bethphage. He was dusty and tired, and his feet were wrapped in rags. He asked if he could rest in the shade and drink some water, and Amos, now older, his beard beginning to show threads of gray, invited him in and offered him bread and figs. The traveler looked at Amos's workshop, at the tools and the half-finished carvings and the apprentices working at their benches, and shook his head in admiration. "You have built something remarkable," he said. "I have built what my father started," Amos replied. "I just walked the road he showed me. That is a good road to walk. It is the only road I know." The traveler finished his food and water and stood to leave. As he did, Amos noticed his feet, bruised, blistered, bound in rags that were barely holding together. He went to the storeroom at the back of the workshop and returned with a pair of sandals, well-made, sturdy, designed for long journeys on hard roads. "Take these," Amos said. The traveler looked at the sandals and then at Amos, and something passed between them, a recognition, an understanding, a shared knowledge of what it meant to walk in pain and to be shown kindness by a stranger. "I cannot repay you," the traveler said. "Then do not repay me," Amos replied. "Walk far, and when you find someone whose feet are burning, stop and help them. That is payment enough." The traveler nodded, put on the sandals, and walked out into the bright afternoon, moving down the road with a new steadiness in his step. Amos watched him go, a small figure growing smaller against the vast landscape, and thought of Nathan, of Lydia, of his mother, of Tamar, of his father, of every person who had placed a stone in the path of his life, some to block him and some to build a bridge. He thought of the road, always the road, winding through the heat and the dust and the years, endless and unforgiving and essential. And he thought of his feet, his scarred, calloused, healed human feet, which had carried him from poverty to purpose, from despair to love, from a pair of broken wooden sandals to a life that was, in every way that mattered, a journey worth taking. The sun hung low over the hills of Bethphage, painting the world in shades of amber and rose. Inside the house, Miriam was teaching Lydia a song that her own mother had taught her, a melody so old that no one remembered its origin, only its beauty. Tamar was sketching a new design on a piece of pottery, a pattern of interlocking circles that she wanted Amos to carve into stone. Daniel was in the workshop, practicing his cuts on a piece of scrap limestone, the sound of his chisel striking stone a steady rhythm that echoed through the cooling air. Amos closed his eyes and listened to all of it, the song, the chisel, the distant sounds of the village settling into evening. He felt the cool ground beneath his sandaled feet, the familiar leather and palm fiber that had replaced the wood and desperation of his youth. He felt the weight of the day's work in his muscles and the lightness of the day's purpose in his heart. 26 AD, no protection from heat. Burning feet in simple wood sandals. That was where it started. That was the crucible. That was the fire that forged him. And from that fire, Amos had built a life. Not a perfect life. Not a life free of struggle or pain or the relentless demands of a world that expected much and gave little, but a life of meaning. A life where the things that hurt also taught, where the roads that burned also led somewhere, where the sandals that fell apart were eventually replaced by something stronger. He opened his eyes and looked out at the road that led from his doorstep toward Jerusalem, the same road he had walked 1,000 times, the same road that had tested him and tempered him, and, in its own harsh way, loved him. The road shimmered in the last light of the day, its surface warm but no longer threatening, a path rather than a punishment. Tomorrow, he would walk it again. He would walk it in sandals that protected his feet, with money in his belt and orders in his book and a family waiting for him to come home. He would walk it with the knowledge that the road had not changed, but he had. And that was the miracle, if you could call it that. Not a supernatural event, not a divine intervention. Just the simple, extraordinary miracle of a human being who refused to stop walking, refused to lie down, refused to let the fire beneath his feet consume the fire within his soul. If you have watched this story until now, then you know what it means. You know what it means to walk on burning ground and keep going. You know what it means to wear sandals that are not enough and to keep walking anyway. If you watched until here, it is because you liked this story. Leave a comment saying, "I watched until the end," so I can get to know you and know who really loves the stories on this channel. And if this story made you feel something, if it reminded you of your own burning roads and your own cracked sandals, then hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Because somewhere out there, right now, someone is standing on a hot road with bad shoes, wondering if the journey is worth it. This story is your answer. The journey is always worth it. Subscribe so you never miss another story. The next one might be the one that changes your walk forever. The sun set over Bethphage. The stars appeared, one by one, like promises written in light across the darkening sky. And Amos, the stonecutter, the walker, the son of Eli who had carved sandals from sycamore wood and taught his boy to keep moving, sat in the doorway of his home and felt the cool evening air on his feet, and was grateful. He was grateful for the heat that had tested him. He was grateful for the wood that had carried him. He was grateful for the leather that had replaced it. He was grateful for the road, every mile of it, every stone, every blister, every step. Because without the burning, he would never have learned to walk. And without the walking, he would never have arrived. And that, in the end, is the story of feet that burned and a man who did not stop moving. It is the story of 26 AD, when the ground was on fire and the sandals were made of wood, and the only thing between a man and despair was the decision to take one more step. One more step. Always, always, one more step.